copies of records if the request is made by the post auditor or an employee of post audit for the purpose of conducting an audit pursuant to the Legislative Post Audit Act or any other law. And I can take any questions.
Any questions for Natalie? Seeing none, we'll begin with proponents, and we have the Legislative Post Auditor himself here, Justin Stowe. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. So I will keep this very brief. I've provided a one-page memo from our office in support of this bill. For those of you not familiar with our office, we work at the direction of the Post Audit Committee, which is a joint bipartisan committee. We only bring legislation that they endorse, so I've already run this legislation past them to make sure they were in support. And the idea here is really simple. When we make requests to state or local governments for records, we are not doing that under the authority of the Open Records Act. We are doing it under the authority of the Post Audit Act, which gives me as the post auditor and our staff access to all records, confidential or otherwise. So not just public records, but confidential information that we need to do to complete our work as auditors. However, because state agencies often interact with other public members of the public and other public agencies, they often wonder, well, we know when we go through the open records process that we can charge for that type of time and effort, so can we charge you? And my response is always, no, you may not. Audit is not voluntary, and this is part of the cost of doing business. But I understand kind of their confusion, and I've never really liked the fact that the Open Records Act, in my view, stands in a little bit of contradiction to the audit authority that I have. So my request to the committee is, when we are doing audits, would you please clarify in the Kansas Open Records Act that we are not subject to billing? To me, that is just making our powers consistent. I don't view it as an expansion of my powers. I believe I already have the power to ask agencies to provide records and information to me for the purpose of an audit without them being able to charge me for my time through the Post Audit Act. We reached out to our colleagues. One of the questions the committee that I work for asked, the Post Audit Committee asked, how do other state auditors treat this? So we actually sent out a survey through one of our national associations to all audit offices. 19 responded. They are unanimous in agreement with us. They do not consider their request for audit information to be open records request. It's under a different authority, their audit authority. So we have that listed here. I think it's also important to note, again, we get access to confidential information. That's not covered by the Kansas Open Records Act. So if we were asking under that authority, we couldn't get the information that we do. Finally, I just might mention to the committee, I think it's a little bit ironic to me. I mean, when we talk about audits in most cases, like the private sector, and even in the state's case, when we're dealing with our contracted auditors, there's a host of state government agencies that collectively pay like more than $1 million to have the auditors come in and audit them. So Department of Administration, Kansas Department of Health and Environment, all these large agencies, they pay the auditors to get the audit, and they don't bill the auditors for their time. So if we were asking agencies for this information for our own purposes, then absolutely we should pay. So if I was just curious about what they're doing, then I should be subject to CORA and pay it that way. But when we're doing it under audit, we believe that's a fundamentally different process, that accountability should be baked in to state government. The expectation that if you perform services at taxpayers' expense, that the auditors may come in. We, of course, try to be reasonable with agencies, and we understand there may be some concerns by agencies that we're going to come in and take up lots of their time, and so we try to work with them. But that's the simple premise is I'm trying to align what I believe is already my statutory authority in the Post Audit Act with the Kansas Open Records Act. In practice, we usually work this out with agencies. It hasn't created a lot of problems, but it's an observation we made over the past couple of years that we feel there's a discrepancy. Mr. Chair, happy to answer any questions you, the committee members, may have.
Very good. Committee, any questions? Don't see any in person. Oh, Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sir. I'm not quite certain that I understand this, so maybe I didn't do my homework properly. It appears to me that this proposed bill is for inclusion into the Open Records Act.
That is correct.
There is a Legislative Post Audit Act, isn't there? I'm asking you, would it not be better that you make a provision in your Legislative Post Audit Act that any charges of the open record do not apply to you within your own authority and not that of the open records?
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative, good question. We actually consult with the Office of Revisers when we decide how to craft this. That is certainly an option they considered, and it is an option the legislature could consider. So that certainly putting it in the Post Audit Act is one venue. We thought at the time it would be more elegant and simpler to put it in Kansas Open Record. Maybe it's not. So I think that's definitely debatable, and certainly you make a good point. We did consider that, and I'm not even suggesting that the way we're doing it here is currently exactly right. So yes, it's a fair point. You know, my goal is simply to line those things, definitely different ways we could approach that. Yes, sir.
Any other questions? I'm not seeing any. Thank you. We'll get back
Mr.
to you on the
Chairman.
next bill. Anyone else here as a proponent? We'll move on to neutral, and looks like Amanda Stanley got out of the office today. Thought she'd come visit with us.
This is what happens when I never come here in person. I probably do my mask. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to come here in person and get out of my office and my cave where I just yell at computer screens about technology. So I want to thank you today for allowing me to be a neutral conferee on House Bill 2049. As you heard, this would allow legislative post audit to obtain records without paying for the cost in the Open Records Act. We understand the public policy behind this bill. However, we would ask that if you advance this legislation, it remains a very narrow exception to the Kansas Open Records Act. I do think by putting in this position or in this part of the statute, to Representative Wheeler's point, it does make it messy versus putting in the legislative post audit statute. The legislative post audit statute is confusing. It's not clear cut on what access means and whether or not you could charge fees. By putting in the Open Records Act, then it opens up a whole host of questions about why is there this one special exception for the Open Records Act. In Kansas, we do value good government and open government, and a product of this is the Open Records Act. However, our member cities receive thousands of requests for records every year, and that number continues to increase. Responding to records requests takes significant amount of staff time and resources at the local level. Several times a year, we get requests from out-of-state companies simply looking to mine Kansas citizens' data on a whole host of variety of things. And we provide those records, but they do take time. And also we get lots of requests for single words and emails for an entire city for an entire 6 months or even a year, which takes a significant amount of time to gather. Increasing requests for body cam and vehicle footage are constantly increasing. There's an increasing number of attorneys that use the open records request to avoid discovery, which is perfectly legal, but it does take more time as you continue to respond. So each of these requests takes a lot of time and careful consideration. It often takes redaction for personal information. So if a city cannot recoup those costs from the record requester, as a public policy decision, local governments get their money from property taxes. So you're looking at either a property tax increase or you're looking at cutting of vital services. So if you do make exceptions to the Open Records Act, I know the opponent's testimony has asked that you expand this exception to cover a whole host of other requests from the press. We would be strongly opposed to that and ask that you keep this very limited to legislative post audit. And with that, I am happy to stand for questions at any time.
Very good. I see we have one hand up virtually. Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stanley, at present, do your members charge post-audit in response to their requests?
No, I do not believe any of our members do. There was a large post-audit request this year asking for every association that a city belongs to. It was in May in the middle of the stay-at-home orders, and the most common request I got from cities is who is legislative post-audit, not do we charge for them. It was more about trying to figure out who this agency was.
And so then do your members object to the relief that the post-audit division is requesting in this bill?
I'm sorry, Representative Carmichael, I couldn't hear you. You speak a little louder.
So do your members object to the relief that post-audit is requesting in this bill?
No, we do not. We're neutral on post-audit. We have no issue with the bill in front of us.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else with a question? None in person, and I'm not seeing any online. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Committee, we have two other neutral conferees or testimony from them, from the Kansas Association of Counties and from the City of Overland Park, which should have been emailed to you and is now online. Anyone else here is a neutral conferee? If not, we'll move on to opponents. We have Doug Anstat, and he is on WebEx.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are in opposition to this bill for a number of reasons, but first of all, because it carves out an exception for government that's not available to the public or to the media. This agency just admitted in the testimony that it's not being charged now. Frankly, we've been charged for years, even gouged for years when we in the media try to get public records from governmental agencies. So we have some real concern about carving out a special exception for post audit. Although I understand under their own statute they have this ability not to be charged. So that seemed to take care of the problem. I want to agree with Representative Wheeler that and with Amanda from the league that this would muddy up the Kansas Open Records Act. It does not have this kind of an exception in it under 45-221 or 219, and I had made some other points about what you're considering, but I have a feeling that they really don't necessarily pertain to this particular issue. But we would ask that you not amend the Kansas Open Record Act in this way, and that you keep it in their own post audit statute. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Questions? We have Representative Carmichael.
I apologize for the delay. Mr. Anstat, as I look at your testimony, you suggest to us that there ought to be a public interest exception that applies to records that are requested, and I'm sorry, I can't get my WebEx screen and my document in front of me simultaneously, but at any rate, you suggest that folks shouldn't have to pay for public interest requests, and then there's provision, you say that unless it's in part of a commercial activity. Now, I thought the business of newspapers was selling newspapers, and they do that by collecting the news. Do I misunderstand?
I think you do. What that is referring to is the mining of public records by who are in things that would affect their business as far as their bottom line. And what I'm talking about with the public interest exception is there are certain requests from scholars and from the media that are trying to get records to meet their obligation to be a watchdog of government, and that to me is a different reason for this, and that's why I didn't bring that up, because what post audit is asking for is simply audit types of materials, and those typically wouldn't be accessible to us anyway, especially the confidential parts.
Well, I thought that newspapers were commercial entities designed, for the most part, to produce a profit for their shareholders. I know that, for example, McClatchy has been purchased recently, and it seems to me it's a for-profit business, and I'm just not at all sure why in the world Ms. Stanley's clients should subsidize your client's business.
Well, that's an interesting argument. What the reason we exist is certainly we have to make a profit and stay in business to be able to continue to do what we do. But we don't make any money public, of. It simply allows us to meet our obligation to cover the news and try to stop corruption in government.
Well, then let me ask you a somewhat different question. I got hit a few years ago with a bill for, I don't know, nearly $200 from the city of Wichita requesting information about the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission and the cozy relationship that they had with cell tower developers. And it looks to me like what the Broadcasters and the Press Association is advocating is that I could get around having to pay that fee if instead I go to my neighborhood association who has a newsletter and says, tell them you're a journalist because you've got a newsletter, and request these records, and then we won't have to pay, and then you can give them to me. Is that something that your association is that a door you really want to open here, that anybody who calls themselves the press gets records for free?
Well, anybody that wants to call themselves the press can do that. That's their, if they want to lie about it. But the fact is that newsletters aren't designed. Neighborhood newsletters are not designed to be strictly for dissemination of news. There are all kinds of other reasons they exist, and their primary function is not news gathering, and that's the difference.
Well, I don't want to belabor this. I would certainly disagree, but I would also disagree because newspapers have a whole lot of things in them that aren't news. A crossword puzzle, for example, the comics. There's a whole bunch of things in your publications that aren't news. So hopefully we can just avoid this issue and take care of the post audit's needs and move down the road. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Samsel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One very small, if this is easy, if somebody can help me, I'll make the chairman's life easier. If not, somebody can teach me one-on-one, but I cannot figure out where my button is to raise my hand.
Yeah, so Representative Samsel, on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see participants and then chat right next to it. You see those two?
I do.
If you click participants, all of us will pop up. And then by your name, if you scroll around, you'll see a little raise hand. There you go.
Found it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Anstadt, thank you for being here today. My question is, I heard you mention gouging through prices, other things. I don't think that's unique just to media. I'm a lawyer. I have clients who make similar requests. That's perhaps a problem elsewhere, or maybe it's not a problem. But to me, it's a little bit different issue, but related from the one before us today. But have you submitted to me or anyone, or would you be willing to, what you consider a solution to that be? It strikes me, if we're going to be requesting documents from public agencies, we shouldn't be giving unfunded mandates. If it's the state needs to pay for it in some way, shape, or form. But from private entities, whether it's a company, a corporation, small business, large business, the media, whoever, it seems like if you're putting that burden onto whoever it is, that it seems fair that there's some reasonable balance of public policy, and that's one that this committee could certainly take up and debate. But a fair amount, not only for the documents themselves, any processing cost, whether that's electronic or in paper format, but also, I don't know what the balance is. This committee could consider it, but employee time, hours, making sure you're not gouged, but also there's some nefarious characters out there who just hound request. And so if they're not getting fairly compensated for employee time, and as well as the production cost, that those things can get a bit out of hand. So with that, if you would like to speak to that briefly, sir, or if you want to hit me up offline, but that's something I think this committee would do well to consider over the course of the next session or year or what have you.
I appreciate that. I think that there are some safeguards built in to keep exorbitant types of requests for public notices from happening, and especially, like I said, when they are not of a public information type of request, but they are for commercial commercial ventures. As you pointed out, we and I attached the bill from last year as an attempt that we have been trying for a number of years, as many as 10 and possibly 20 years to kind of get some language in Cora that under this 45-219 that would place some responsible limits on what could be charged, specifically what could be charged for the hourly rates of an employee or an attorney that might have to review the records, or any other kinds of limits that would help us. Representative Carmichael talked about a commercial business. I think everybody understands that that's not we might and fairly soon be called, newspapers might be called a nonprofit industry pretty soon, because it's that serious, and the kinds of rates that we are charged. I'll give you a couple of examples. The Frontenac situation that I mentioned in my testimony was trying to charge $3,500 to two different media companies that wanted a small number of emails that showed that they had made these decisions in a meeting by having a serial meeting. And a few years ago, we had a teacher or a parent from the Mays School District, when the school district added a second high school, and they wanted to know how the students were assigned to each high school. They asked for that information. They first couldn't get it, and finally they were offered that information for $982. It was about 3 sentences.
And Mr. Anstead, and Mr. I apologize for interrupting you there. I hear you. Out of respect of everybody's time, and if the chairman's okay with it, if you would like, if I'm not your cup of tea, fine. We have a bunch of brilliant people on this committee. We obviously have been very busy with some other pressing issues, but I would be more than happy to work with these things on you one-on-one or anybody else. And then these details that we're getting into, take those up and fix them. So please continue if you want, and then with the chair's committee, but out of respect of everybody else's time, it might be more beneficial to work with those one-on-one.
I'll be glad to talk to you. We'll just do that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions? Representative Wheeler.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would like to ask Natalie a question.
Sure, she's ready.
Natalie, I may have misunderstood, or maybe I didn't hear correctly, but I thought I understood Mr. Clark to indicate that the revisor's office felt like it would be better to put this provision in the Open Records Act rather than in the Post Audit Act. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, I actually, when you first raised that, I conferred with Tamara, who is our attorney who staffs the Post Audit Committee, to get a little bit of background on, what the thinking was there. And it sounds like one of the things we thought about was the fact that when, and Amanda Stanley kind of alluded to this, actually, these agencies are kind of like Post Audit, who is Post Audit. And so the thought was that if we put it in the Post Audit Act, they might miss that information, whereas those agencies or municipalities are looking at the Open Records Act and responding to open records requests pretty regularly. And so they're going to see that in the Open Records Act. I don't think it would hurt anything to put it in both places, but I do think it sounds to me, and Justin, correct me if I'm wrong here, it sounds to me that the confusion is just about the stuff that would otherwise be a public record. So it doesn't sound like they're getting charged for the things that would be confidential or anything like that. They're just getting charged for the ones that would otherwise be an open record. And so I think that's why it was kind of put in the open records provision. But certainly it could go in both.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Jennings.
Can we go back to the conferee from Post Audit for a moment? Great. So I'm curious, Would you know offhand for fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20, how much legislative post-audit paid to local units of government to obtain requested documents? Do you know offhand?
I do, sir.
And what would those values be?
Nothing.
And so to follow up then, if the practice is now that none of them are paying anything, what exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve here?
Representative, good question. So for us, it's the time and effort and energy we have to go through with state agencies to walk them through the access to the Post Audit Act, convince them that we already have the authority to do that, negotiate through that process, which you're right, is selfishly a minor amount of time for my agency. So that's where, whether it would go in the Open Records Act or the Post Audit Act, I'm indifferent. We stumble on this periodically, and I, out of policy, don't pay. I get requests to pay, and then I negotiate and say, no, I'm not going to pay because I have that access. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. You're right, it's very narrow, related to us. But as a matter of policy, we don't do that. I don't like to have matters of policy that don't align with state law as your auditor. So when I say, I'm not gonna pay it, and they say, we think statute says you may have to, that's what I'm trying to reconcile.
Representative Wheeler.
And I do appreciate your problem and what you've indicated, but what I heard you say is that you have to educate these public agencies as to the Post Audit Act. And yet it's suggested that we put it in another act. It would seem that if you're educating these agencies, as troubling as that might be, that it would be better to be in your own act.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I have no personal problem with that at all. I would stand on maybe the counsel and advice of advisors. I think they were also somewhat indifferent. So Natalie's clearly explained some logic, which makes sense to me that might help them. But I'm amenable to that concept wherever you want to put it. And I realize this is my particular problem. So if that makes better sense to keep it out of Cora, I'm completely warm to that idea, whatever revisers would say.
Please understand, I'm not trying to be argumentative. I am inquiring. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your cooperation.
Committee, we also have written opponent testimony from the Kansas Association of Broadcasters. Is there anyone else here as an opponent? Not seeing any committees, any questions for anyone? Not seeing any there. So I will close the hearing on House Bill 2049 and open the hearing on House Bill 2050 and ask Natalie to give us a brief overview of this one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2050 would remove the requirement to submit certain documents to the Legislative Division of Post Audit. So Section 1 amends KSA 224514A. Current law provides there that a nonprofit corporation organized for the purpose of providing legal services to indigent inmates is required to submit an audited statement of expenditures to the post auditor and to the Director of Budget. This bill would remove the requirement to submit that to the post auditor. Section 2 amends KSA 753728C. Current law there provides that 30 days after the Director of Accounts and Reports authorizes any write-off of accounts receivables to, or taxes receivable, the Director shall certify the receivables written off to the post auditor. This bill would remove that requirement. Section 3 amends KSA 76721. Current law there provides that if the Board of Regents or a state educational institution enters into a contract related to the operation or functions of the board or institution with a corporation whose operations are substantially controlled by the board or that educational institution, that contract then has to provide that the books and records of the corporation would be provided to the post auditor. And so this bill removes that requirement. And then finally, Section 4 amends KSA 793233B. Current law there provides that the Secretary of Revenue has to create an annual report on abatements that reduce final tax liability for a taxpayer by $5,000 or more. Those reports have to identify the taxpayer, summarize the reasons for the abatement, and state the amount abated. Current law also requires that that report be submitted to the Division of Post Audit. So this bill would just remove that submission requirement. And I can take any questions.
Questions for Natalie? Not see any. We'll move on to proponents and welcome Mr. Stowe back again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, hopefully this bill is even simpler than the last one I thought I was bringing before you. The bottom line here is that we used to be in the financial audit business, and state law requires several entities that Natalie listed to provide us reports. We're no longer in that business. I don't need those reports. I feel like it's a waste of their time, and I don't want to waste their time. If there was reasons for those reports to go other places, that might be okay, but it doesn't sound like there need to be. They already sent it out to multiple other various oversight agencies. The one exception being the write-off report, which is already within the department or the Director of Accounts and Reports, which is the one that probably should know about it. So it's a very small thing. Again, it's just in the interest of lean government. We don't need it. They send us these reports. They have to track it, report it to us, and then we file it and don't do anything with it. So as your auditor, I don't like to receive reports I don't use. So that's the simple intent behind it is don't have them send it to us if we don't need it. Happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Stowe, do the members of your committee see the reports in question here, or do they just go straight to you and you put them in a file drawer?
Good question, Representative. Only one of these ever are supposed to go to our committee. That is the write-off report. We do provide that to the Post Audit Committee every year. Because they support this legislation, I presume they don't find value in that either. It's not at a level where they can really provide much oversight. It's just a list of the total amounts written off, and it's something that goes through. So the other three, though, we simply file internally. The statutory requirement is not that it go to them, and they have no interest in it either.
And you said something there that concerned me just a little bit, but so you say they support this. Are you meaning the Post Audit Committee has introduced or issued a letter or an opinion or something that says they think this is a good idea?
So Representative, as the Post Auditor, I don't introduce any legislation that I don't have them vote on first. So I run these by them conceptually and ask for their approval to present them as bills to the legislature. So yes, they've already given their vote approval bringing this legislation to the legislature for its consideration.
So sometime prior to this session, legislative post audit did take a formal vote, considered these matters, and recommended the legislation that is before us today.
That is correct, sir.
Well, I find that persuasive. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Samsel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, this is not a question. It's actually, I just note that Mr. Anstedt's still on the line. I looked at his written submissions and I don't see an email address or a cell phone number on there. So I'm just making the offer if he wants to text me or email me or something. I think we already had that, but I just wanted to make it clear. So I couldn't find his direct contact information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We will make sure we figure out how to get you two connected. Anyone else questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Hey, Mr. Chair.
Is there anyone else here as a proponent? Anyone else as a neutral conferee? Anyone as an opponent? Seeing none, going to close the hearing on House Bill 2050. Committee, I forgot at the beginning. Any requests for bill introductions? Don't have any on my list, just making sure no one else had any. Not seeing any. Committee, if you will, I can't say get out, but pull up House Bill 2008. While you're pulling that up, we'll have Natalie remind us what this bill's all about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2008 would authorize the Attorney General's office to coordinate training on murdered and missing Indigenous peoples. They would be able to coordinate that training with all the appropriate law enforcement agencies across the state and with the different Native American Indian tribes.
Any questions for Natalie? Are there any amendments on this bill, committee? Seeing none, is there a motion concerning this bill? Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd move this bill out favorably.
Got a motion. Is there a second? Representative Heiberger. Any discussion? Seeing none, and just a reminder, if you are not in the Capitol, please refrain from voting. Representative Schreiber, would you like to close? For the motion, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All in favor say no. Very good. Bill passes. Thank you, committee.
Mr. Chairman, this is
yes.
Representative Carmichael. I'd ask that my affirmative vote be recorded in the minutes.
You got it. And you know, I like what Representative Jennings did the other day, but I didn't listen close enough to remember, so we'll do that on Monday. Kathy, we have Representative Owens, Representative this is recording their affirmative votes. You ready? Owens, O'Hobson, Heiberger, Hoheisel, and Carmichael. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Yes, Representative Samsel.
Please help me remember, when we do obviously this one seems to be unanimous, but if we have votes in the future and we're participating this way and we are in the Capitol building, how do we need to, like, we can speak up like normal, or is there a way that we need to, how do we communicate our votes to you, I guess I'm asking?
Like if you're in the building or not in the building?
In the building.
Well, I think unless it's close, I'm going to continue to do a voice vote. But if it's at all close, I will ask for a roll call vote. So if in doubt, we'll go that route. But on these that seem to be pretty much slam dunks, I think we'll continue to do voice vote. But any that are close, we'll make sure and do roll call.
Thank you. That's what I was wondering.
If not, yes, Representative Jennings.
For the, maybe for the sake of economy for the revisor's office, I expect that there may be interest in an amendment to the first bill we heard that would take this exemption from any fees that might otherwise be chargeable under open records, but put that in the post auditor's statute. I mean, I'll do it. I don't care who does it, but if somebody's going to do it, let's not all ask her and have her not be able to talk to us about it and have 7 of them. That doesn't make sense. So we'll try to take care of Natalie in this if we can.
Got it. It's actually already been requested by a member who's online. Sent an email to Natalie and asked for that very thing. So I appreciate that. She doesn't need to make 17 amendments for the same thing.
But Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to defer to Representative Jennings on that. I want to see the amendment get on.
We'll call it the Carpenter-Jennings amendment, but then we better have Owens come up. We better have Owens have a second one ready to go. Okay, no meeting tomorrow, guys. We've got several on Monday. We will see you all in the morning. Thank you. Meeting's adjourned.